Today we're going to be discussing one of Isaiah's prophecies against the people of Babylon, with a particular focus on this one portion of the prophecy that some people think has to do with the fall of Satan. So let's talk about it. Hey everybody, my name is David Tate, and this is Now Let's Be Honest for another video in our series walking through the Old Testament prophets, where we are, Lord willing, walking all the way from the book of Isaiah to the book of Malachi, book by book, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. Today we are going to be moving into a new section of Isaiah, and so if this is your first video, this is a good place to start because you're not going to need a whole lot of context to understand what we're talking about today, but I do hope that you'll go back and watch the previous videos because I think there's a lot of really good stuff there, and that's why we're doing this whole series. Be sure, before we get into this, to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, just so that you know whenever other videos like this or other things that I put on this channel are coming out. That's always very helpful to this channel, and I really appreciate you. Also, two quick announcements. Like usual, if you want access to the slides that I'm using for this presentation or for this video, you can access those at nowletsbehonest.com/resources or by clicking in the link in the description down below, and I have those for you for absolutely free. I'm not charging for those. I just want y'all to have access to those, whether you're using those for other Bible studies, whether you're using those to take notes, or whether sometimes it might just be that the text that I have on the screen is too small to read, so you can have that pulled up as we go through these videos. Second announcement, if you would like to support me on Patreon, you can do so at patreon.com/David Tate. By no means do I want you to feel obligated to do that. I want to give you this content for free, but some of y'all have asked to be able to do that, and so I made that available for you in case you want to support me. Other than that, though, I think it's about time that we just hop into this Bible study because we have got a lot to cover today. So I'm going to pray for us, and we'll get started. Lord, we thank you for another day to get to know you more. As we go into your word, I pray that you will speak through me and that your spirit will be present with us, both with me on this side of the camera, but also with anybody who's watching this video. That you would be governing our minds and our hearts and opening them up to receive whatever you have to tell us in your word. It's not very often that we get to go take in-depth dives into the prophets in the Old Testament, because sometimes we neglect those books because we think they're boring or they're weird and we just don't really know what to do with them. And so I pray that you will use this video as a catalyst or a jumping off point that would help people desire to go study these books even more deeply. And that through these studies you would shape our hearts so that we would leave this place in a changed manner, so that we wouldn't just puff ourselves up with knowledge, but that we would actually go forth in a manner that makes us want to live for you more. And gives us this hunger to glorify you more, God. Because that's the ultimate goal of all of this. We want to be as close to you as possible, and we want to live for you as much as possible all the days of our lives. So please work on our hearts, God. Soften our hearts and make us ready and open for whatever you have to tell us in your word today. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right, so like I said, today we are going to be jumping into a new section of Isaiah, and this one is going to be a pretty long section that we're going to be covering over the next few weeks, where Isaiah actually begins to direct his attention to the foreign nations surrounding the people of Judah. If you've been with us so far, just to briefly summarize what we've covered, is basically chapters 1 through 12. Chapter 1 was more of an introduction to the book, but chapters 2 through 12 was a prolonged series of prophecies that the prophet Isaiah was directing against the people of Judah, who is his main audience for this book, right? So we had a bunch of different stuff where he was just prophesying against them, telling them what was going to happen to them, specifically in regards to the coming Assyrian invasion. And throughout that, we actually had a lot of really positive promises where, I kind of mixed the word promises and prophecies there. That was kind of fun. But yeah, so we had a bunch of prophecies that were kind of very negative concerning what was going to happen to the people of Judah at this time period. But in the midst of this, Isaiah interspersed a bunch of promises about this coming kingdom that God was going to establish, and that God was still going to be with his people through all of this. What we see is that God being with his people, with the southern kingdom of Judah, is a very prominent theme in the book of Isaiah, right? And that's where we get the word Emmanuel, which means God with us. And we've been working through that chapter by chapter, trying to figure out what exactly is this Emmanuel concept? What does that mean? What is the prophecy about Emmanuel talking about? And we worked through that, and ultimately, it's about exactly what it sounds like. God is going to be with his people. But now we see a transition, because going into chapter 13 and really lasting for a good portion, I think it's through chapter like 23-ish of this book, we're going to have prophecies where Isaiah is not speaking directly to the people of Judah, but he's talking to the surrounding nations that were typically enemies of the people of Judah. And we might wonder, why would Isaiah do this? Because most likely, a lot of these nations never actually encountered the words that Isaiah said. So, why would Isaiah go about doing this? Why would the Spirit of God inspire Isaiah to include this information? I think there's multiple answers to this. I think on one side, this is to reassure the people of God, the people of Judah, once again, that God is still with them, right? So yes, you have all these enemies on all sides, but most of these are oracles of judgment against these foreign nations that would reassure the people of Judah that God has not abandoned them, that God is still with them, and that he will fulfill his promises. Secondly, I think that this also serves to warn the people of Judah, because guess what? If God is going to judge these foreign nations for these sins that they're committing, how much more accountable are the people of God who have received specific revelation from God? All these other nations are pagan nations who they don't have Bibles, right? They don't have their Old Testament. They don't have that stuff, yet they're still being judged for these sins. How much more accountable are the people of Judah of these things? And so, I think that's why Isaiah would include this as well. There was a third thing that I was going to say, and for some reason it's kind of just going away from my mind right now. Well, I think one thing is to authenticate Isaiah's message. That's not the thing I was originally going to think of. I probably should have written these out so that I could actually just say them all. But if I think about it later, I'll put it in the comments or something. But I'll probably just forget. But another thing would be to authenticate Isaiah's message, right? So that whenever these things actually come to pass, everybody will be able to go back to what Isaiah said and be like, oh yeah, he predicted this a long time ago. That must mean that the rest of the things that he's saying are true. And so those are at least three reasons why I think Isaiah would include this in his book, even though it's not directly about the people of Judah. But at the same time, there are many other reasons, some of which are just kind of jumping out of my mind, and those are actually just things I was thinking off the cuff. But there are other reasons as well, and I wish that I could remember the other one because I thought it was a really good one. But for right now, I'm just kind of rambling on about this. Let's actually jump into the text, and let's see what Isaiah has to say to the people of Babylon. And as you can see by the title of this, he's telling them that Babylon will fall. All right, so I'm going to read a good portion of this first. The oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw. On a bare hill raise a signal, cry aloud to them, wave the hand for them to enter the gates of the nobles. I myself have commanded my consecrated ones, and have summoned my mighty men to execute my anger, my proudly exulting ones. The sound of tumult is on the mountains, as of a great multitude, the sound of an uproar of kingdoms, of nations gathering together. The Lord of hosts is mustering a host for battle. They come from a distant land, from the end of the heavens. The Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. So what you can see here on the screen, presuming if you're actually looking at this, you can see that I've included a map here, and what I'm doing is, for each of these different people that Isaiah is talking against, I'm going to include a map to let you know where specific this place is in regards to the people of Israel. So, if you're in the land of Judah or Israel, and you just travel directly eastward for a long while, you would get into the land of Babylon. Most likely this is not the trajectory you would take, because there was a lot of desert in between. Typically you'd probably travel up north towards Syria, and then you'd go southeast to actually get to Babylon. But that's just where it's at on a map, just so you know where we're talking about. It's roughly the land, I guess, what would that be, like Iraq? That would be roughly where Babylon was at. So between the Tigris and Euphrates River, just south of Assyria, which is the nation that we have been talking a whole lot about over the past few weeks, and which we will talk about again next week. But for right now, we're dealing with Babylon, and it starts off in verse 1, the oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw. Let's talk about Babylon real quick at this time period. Although Babylon existed at the time of this prophecy, roughly 740 to 725 BC, it would only dominate the region from 605 to 539 BC, destroying Jerusalem and taking the people of Judah captive in 586 BC, 100 years after the end of Isaiah's ministry in 686 BC. I say all that because what this tells us is that Isaiah is seeing stuff way, 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 way into the future, despite the fact that 1, Babylon has not yet risen to its full power, and 2, it will not be destroyed for nearly 200 more years. Isaiah is able to foresee what will befall it, and as we'll see in this chapter and in the next chapter that we're going through, he's going to see in specific what is going to be happening to these people. And so this is a really, really cool thing where a few hundred years later, people are going to be like, whoa, Isaiah predicted this to a T hundreds of years ago. But yeah, so Babylon. Babylon has been around for a very, very long time. We can trace this back to Genesis chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel. That was the beginning of Babylon, right? You hear about this other guy, like I think it's in the chapter before, Genesis chapter 10, where we hear about this guy named Nimrod. And Nimrod was the guy who actually created Babylon. I think he created Assyria as well. I could be speaking wrong there, but I'm pretty sure he did. Nimrod was the founder of Babylon. And it seems like he was actually the guy who kind of saw to the whole building of Babel and the Tower of Babel on the plain of Shinar in Genesis chapter 11. And Babylon has been around for that entire time period ever since way back then, all the way until the time that Isaiah is around, and even for a few hundred years after Isaiah is around. And so what we know about Babylon is that they had existed for a very, very long time, and they were somewhat relevant throughout all those years, but it wasn't really until Isaiah's time period and afterwards that they really began to rise to prominence, right? So at this time period, they're still not as prominent as they would be, but eventually the Babylonian Empire would be the one to overthrow the Assyrian Empire, and eventually Babylon would be the big deal. They would be the bee's knees for a time period to where eventually, over 100 years after Isaiah stopped his ministry, Isaiah's ministry ended around 686 BC, 100 years later, in 586 BC, Babylon's going to come in and destroy the people of Judah. But Isaiah's not even just talking about that moment. Isaiah's looking past the destruction of Judah, and he's looking forward to the destruction of Babylon by the hands of the Medes and the Persians, which is going to happen way later in like 539 BC and up until I think like 518, 519 BC. So Isaiah is looking way, way, way into the future, and that's what this entire prophecy is dealing with. And so I just wanted to emphasize that because that's actually really, really cool. But let's see what Isaiah says. On a bare hill, raise a signal. Cry aloud to them, wave the hand for them to enter the gates of the nobles. I myself have commanded my consecrated ones, and have summoned my mighty men to execute my anger, my proudly exulting ones. You'll notice there that I have that text in blue because this is God speaking in regards to what he is going to do to the people of Babylon. God is presented as a general gathering together an army of troops and preparing them to march against Babylon. His anger by this time will have turned from his own people onto Babylon, and so he assembles foreign nations to destroy them. Because like I said, in between when Isaiah is speaking and when these events are happening, Babylon will come in and they will destroy the land of Judah and take the people of Judah captive. Isaiah isn't talking about that right now. Instead, he's foreseeing the time when God's anger turns away from his people and is directed towards Babylon. So he says, on a bare hill, raise a signal. The images of a person on a bare hill where everybody can see them, raising up a signal, crying aloud to all the foreign nations and all the armies to rise up and turn against Babylon. Wave the hand for them to enter the gates of the nobles. I myself, God, have commanded my consecrated ones, the ones that he has set apart, and have summoned my mighty men to execute my anger, my proudly exulting ones. So, we talked about this in past weeks as well. God can use evil pagan people to accomplish his perfect good will. It's really weird how he can do that, but he does that in his sovereignty, not because they recognize they're being used as vessels for his glory, but because he's just that good. So we see how Assyria is going to be used. In past chapters we saw this. Assyria is going to be raised up to judge the people of Israel and the people of Judah and the people of Syria. They're going to be used by God to do that. Babylon is also going to be used by God to do that. But then God's also going to raise up other people to judge the people of Babylon. And so what we see is that God is just in charge of everything. And I think that's the message we're supposed to get across from this. Oh, I just remembered what the fourth reason was of why I think Isaiah includes this. It's to point out that God's in charge of everything, right? Yes, that was the whole thing. The land of Judah is God's special people, right? These are God's chosen people, his holy nation, his kingdom of priests. But what Isaiah is proving by including all these oracles against the nations is that God is not limited to the people of Judah. This is the God of Israel and the God of Judah, but he's also the God who created the heavens and the earth. And so, by including these oracles, we're seeing that God is actually in charge of everything. He is the king of the universe. There was the fourth thing that I wanted to list. So boom, there we go. Now I don't have to put it in the comments. Verse 4, the sound of a tumult is on the mountains, as of a great multitude. The sound of an uproar of kingdoms, of nations gathering together. So Isaiah sees this, and you can hear all the armies coming together, and he sees it's like a big tumult. It's scary. It's freaking him out. The Lord of hosts is mustering a host for battle. So you see, the Lord of hosts, we talk about how the word host there, we talked about this in the past. The word host is talking about the angel armies, the angelic armies behind God. He is the general, and he has all the angel armies behind him. And he himself, the God of angel armies, is gathering human armies for battle. They come from a distant land, from the end of the heavens, the Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. So God is gathering all these people together, and they're going to march against Babylon. They're going to destroy it. We're actually going to hear about this whenever we get to the book of Daniel, because we're actually going to see this playing out. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. As destruction from the Almighty, it will come. Therefore all hands will be feeble, and every human heart will melt. They will be dismayed. Pangs and agony will seize them. They will be in anguish like a woman in labor. They will look aghast at one another. Their faces will be aflame. We've talked about the day of the Lord in past weeks, but this is actually the first time that we actually encounter those explicit words in the book of Isaiah. So far, we've actually just heard him say, in that day, in that day, in that day, in that day. But right here, he actually says the words, the day of the Lord. In Hebrew, this is Yom Yahweh. Typically, this day can be viewed as having both a near fulfillment and a far fulfillment. Typically, how I would portray this is the near fulfillment is the day of the Lord, little d, whereas the far fulfillment, the eschatological end times fulfillment, the ultimate day of the Lord, is capital D, day of the Lord. Depending on the context, it can speak of either judgment or salvation, right? So the day of the Lord is a good thing for those people who are serving God, but it's a bad thing for those people who are opposed to God. In the case of Babylon, it's a bad thing. In general, it speaks of the day, that is the time period when God decides to take action. Whenever you hear Day of the Lord, you could be thinking literal 24-hour time period when God is going to take action, but it also could be talking about this broad scoping time where it is just the time of God's judgment. And so, depending on the context, you're going to take different things from this. It doesn't seem like the Day of the Lord is one single event, but it's multiple different events that look forward to this ultimate final event that will take place at the end of times. In this context, Yom Yahweh probably speaks in the short term of Babylon's destruction by the Medes in 539 BC, and in the long term of its final eschatological destruction at the hands of God himself. Go look at Revelation 18:2, where it talks about Babylon falling, and we'll have to talk about, I guess we won't have to really talk about it because we're not dealing with Revelation, but whether or not the Babylon in Revelation is the same as the Babylon here, that's up for debate. But okay, so let's get back to the text. Wail for the day of the Lord, the day that God is going to come and judge, the day of God's action. It's near, it's approaching, which is really ironic because once again, it's not near at all from a human perspective. It's still a few hundred years off, but it's still near. As destruction from the Almighty, it will come. Isaiah speaks confidently. Therefore, all hands will be feeble, and every human heart will melt. All the hands are growing weak. You can see that the imagery he's painting is that of people being incapable of stopping this event from happening. The destruction of Babylon is certain, and even right now, before Babylon has even risen to its full power, its destruction is absolutely certain. It's going to happen. People cannot stop it. Their hands are feeble. Their hearts will melt. They will be dismayed. Pangs and agony will seize them. They will be in anguish like a woman in labor. Like a woman in labor, her pains they become more and more frequent and more severe. That's what it's going to be like for the people of Babylon, because they're going to think they can stop it. And then slowly but surely they're going to realize they can't stop it. And then boom, very quickly, it's going to happen. And they're going to be destroyed. They will look aghast at one another. Their faces will be aflame. And then he continues, behold, the day of the Lord, Yom Yahweh, once again. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and to destroy its sinners from it. So we see why the day of the Lord is coming. It's to destroy the sinners, right? It is God's righteous judgment, God's righteous and holy wrath being poured out on a pagan and foreign and sinful people. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. So, there's different ways that we could look at this verse, right? Some people would just look at this as an apocalyptic type imagery right here, right? So maybe it's not speaking literally about the stars and constellations not giving light, but the imagery is that it will be a deep time of darkness and despair. But this could be viewed as a threat against the Babylonian gods. Egyptians, Assyrians, Canaanites, and other pagan religious practices involved worshiping the heavenly bodies such as the sun, the moon, and the stars. I mean, famously, there's the Egyptian god Ra, or Re, right? And he is the god of the sun. And studying their movements in search of omens on which they base their decisions. So it could be that God is warning the Babylonians that when he comes for them, not even their gods will be able to help them. I don't know which way to interpret this, but I think both are actually valid and both are definitely true. Whether you're taking this more metaphorically, no matter what, it's probably metaphorically. But if you're taking it metaphorically to be speaking about just being a severe time of darkness that nobody can prevent, that's true. But then you could also take this to be talking about how the gods themselves, the Babylonian gods, will not be able to come help them. That's also equally true. And so either way, whichever way you interpret this, it is a valid theological statement and it is true. Basically what Isaiah is saying is that Babylon is screwed. Moving on. Now God is speaking and saying all the things that he is going to do against Babylon. I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant, and lay low the pompous pride of the ruthless. I will make people more rare than fine gold, and mankind than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place, at the wrath of the Lord of hosts, in the day of his fierce anger. And like a hunted gazelle, or like sheep with none to gather them, each will turn to his own people, and each will flee to his own land. Whoever is found will be thrust through, and whoever is caught will fall by the sword. Their infants will be dashed in pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be plundered, and their wives ravished. This is dark stuff. I don't want you to think that I'm taking this lightly. This is very, very dark, heavy material, but we got to wrestle through it because it is the Word of God. It's here for a reason. And right here, we actually get to see what the sin of Babylon was for why they're being destroyed. And so the people of Judah would be hearing this and they'd be like, ooh, we don't want to replicate that sin. And resultantly, I think that we also, as Christians, should look at this and say, we're even more accountable than the people of Judah, right? The people of Judah at the time period that Isaiah is writing, they didn't even have an entire Old Testament, right? Because the Old Testament was still being written. And honestly, the majority of the Old Testament was not written yet at the time period when they're receiving this, right? They mainly had the Torah and they probably had a few other books. That's it. And God's holding them accountable. Not only do we have the entire Old Testament, but we have the entire New Testament as well. And so we definitely are accountable before God. Later on, we're going to hear about Sodom and Gomorrah as we talk through this. And there's this one really good book by Leonard Ravenhill, and it's called Sodom Had No Bible. And I think that the title itself speaks volumes, right? Sodom had no Bible, but God still destroyed them. How much more accountable to God are we? That's what we need to take from this. And so as we read this, yes, it's heavy material. Yes, it's serious, but it's there for a reason, and we need to learn from it. God says, I will punish the world for its evil. I'm not looking at the Hebrew right now, but I imagine that the word for the world right there is haaretz, right? And it's probably talking about, the way that term can be used, it could be spoken broadly about the entire world, or it could be talking specifically about a specific land, right? So specifically the world of the Babylonians, that specific land. I think that it probably means both, right? You have the little d, day of the Lord, where he is going to punish Babylon for their evil, but you also have the capital D, day of the Lord, where God is going to punish the entire world for its evil. Well, guess what? We belong to that world, and so we want to make sure that we're heeding what Isaiah is saying so that we are not going to be part of that judgment. And ultimately, that comes back to placing your faith in God, right? It's not just doing the right things, it's having your faith in the right person. I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. Once again, we see that God is emphasizing his justice and righteousness in what he's about to do. I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant and lay low the pompous pride of the ruthless. here we see exactly why Babylon's going to be destroyed. It is going to be for her pride. And we're going to talk about this pride a lot whenever we talk about the king of Babylon, who is going to be an embodiment of all the people of Babylon. But God is specifically going to be coming against the people of Babylon for their pride. And once again, if you want a hint at what this pride is like, go read the book of Daniel, because you have a lot of that, specifically with the character of Nebuchadnezzar. This dude was a proud, proud guy, the king of Babylon, and God does judge him because of the things that happen there. So God says, I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant and lay low the pompous pride of the ruthless. Once again, we have that imagery and that theme of the pride and humble coming up once again in Isaiah. This is a theme throughout the entire thing. I would actually say it's probably the single most predominant theme in Isaiah. The proud will be humbled, the humble will be exalted. It's exactly the type of stuff that Jesus says whenever he shows up in the Gospels. I will make people more rare than fine gold, and mankind than the gold of Ophir. Right? So God says what he's going to do to the people of Babylon in specific is going to result in such catastrophe and destruction that the people are more rare than fine gold. You'll look everywhere, but you'll be... good luck finding them. You'll have a tough time. Because that's how dispersed these people are going to be. This is how they're going to be destroyed. God is going to bring a full end to the people of Babylon. Therefore, I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place. Notice that we have both heavens and earth being shaken and trembling because of what God's doing. Once again, I've brought this up before, but it reminds me of the song Awesome God by Rich Mullins. When he rolls up his sleeves, he ain't just putting on the Ritz. Our God is an awesome God. There's lightning in his footsteps and thunder in his fists. Our God is an awesome God. I think that song, in many ways, does embody, specifically those lines, it embodies the imagery that the prophets are going for whenever they talk about the day of the Lord. God is coming with might and fury. The heavens and the earth alike are trembling, and they're quaking at what God is about to do. At the wrath of the Lord of hosts, in the day of his fierce anger. So we see the word in the day there once again, right? In the day of the Lord, in the day of the Lord, in the day of the Lord, in that day, the heavens and the earth will tremble at the wrath of Yahweh, of the angels' armies, right? The God of angel armies, he's coming. He's got all his armies behind him. He's got angelic forces. He's got human forces coming with him on this day. And therefore the heavens and the earth are trembling. Physical forces, spiritual forces, everybody's trembling because God is angry, he's mad, and he's coming for judgment. And like a hunted gazelle, or like sheep with none to gather them, each will turn to his own people, and each will flee to his own land. People are going to be freaking out. They're going to be turning this way and that, trying to find safety, but they won't be able to find any. Whoever is found will be thrust through, and whoever is caught will fall by the sword. Their infants, their babies, will be dashed in pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be plundered, and their wives ravished. Yikes. That's dark. All these things will occur whenever the Medes invade and destroy Babylon, partly due to the wickedness of the Medes, partly due to the just judgment of God as a consequence for Babylon's sin. I want to clarify that. Not everything that's happening here is good, right? Yes, God is judging the people, but that doesn't mean that everything happening here is approved of by God necessarily. Yes, it is just judgment, but some of these things are blatantly evil. Whenever the Medes come in and they're going to do these things to Babylon, the Medes are also going to have to be judged by God for what they are doing. And so keep in mind that God is ultimately going to judge everybody for what they did. Yes, he is using wicked and evil people to accomplish his perfect will, but those wicked evil people are not going to do that perfectly, and so they're going to have to be judged as well eventually too. But God is patient, and he's not bringing all things to an end at one time. And so for right now, he's using imperfect beings to bring about his perfect will. And so things are going to get really bad. Infants are going to be broken into pieces, right? They're just going to be dashed because it's terrible. And then the women are going to be ravished. This is very sad, very heartbreaking. And I think that we're supposed to recognize that. Even though Babylon is the enemy of Judah, we're not supposed to be rejoicing at the destruction that's going to come. In one side, we're supposed to be like, yes, God is faithful to his people. We should be happy about that. But we shouldn't necessarily be happy about what's having to happen, because that's a result of sin, and we shouldn't rejoice in the fact that sin happened, and that sin is happening. We should rejoice in God's justice, and we should rejoice in God's judgment, But I don't think we should necessarily rejoice in the destruction of the sinner, if that makes sense. Let's move on. Behold, I am stirring up the Medes against them, who have no regard for silver, and do not delight in gold. Their bows will slaughter the young men. They will have no mercy on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes will not pity children. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. No Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherds will make their flocks lie down there. But wild animals will lie down there, and their houses will be full of howling creatures. There ostriches will dwell, and there wild goats will dance. Hyenas will cry in its towers, and jackals in the pleasant places. Its time is close at hand, and its days will not be prolonged. Whew! So right here, notice that God mentions explicitly, through Isaiah, the Medes. This prophecy was made around 100 years before Babylon would even rise to dominance in around 626 BC. Yet Isaiah accurately predicts exactly who would destroy them in 539 BC, nearly 200 years after this prophecy was given. The Medes and the Babylonians would actually be allies in 610 BC in order to overthrow the Assyrian Empire, which makes the prophecy even more impressive. This is what God is doing through Isaiah. This is cool. This is why, prophecy in and of itself is one of the greatest validations we have of the Bible being the Word of God. Because this is Isaiah writing 200 years before the Medes are going to destroy Babylon, yet he's accurately predicting the fact that it's going to be the Medes who destroy them, despite the fact that in between those two moments, the Medes are actually going to be allies with Babylon. So how could anybody ever foresee this? If people were in Isaiah's time period, they would probably be thinking, well, no, it actually looks like Babylon and the Medes, it seems like they're actually working their way towards an alliance. They're not against one another. They're working their way towards being partners. And Isaiah's like, yeah, it looks like that for now, but I'm telling you, sure, in 100 years they'll be allies, but Babylon's going to rise to power. The Medes aren't going to like that, and they're eventually going to actually turn against Babylon and help see to their destruction. This is crazy. Isaiah is looking way, way, way into the future, and so this would definitely authenticate his message whenever this comes to pass, not necessarily for the people at his time period, because keep in mind, whenever God called Isaiah to ministry, he told him that most people were not going to believe his message. And so Isaiah is preaching primarily for people long term to believe what he's saying, though he is directing things he directs some stuff to people at that time period, such as King Ahaz. He gave him a sign in that moment. Maher-shalal-Hashbaz was born, and that was supposed to prove to Ahaz, you should trust in God, not in the people of Assyria. And so Isaiah says that God is going to stir up the Medes against them, who have no regard for silver and do not delight in gold. These guys, you're not going to be able to pay them off. You're not going to be able to stop them. They're going to just come after Babylon. Their bows will slaughter the young men, and they will have no mercy on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes will not pity children. These guys are going to be brutal, and that's exactly what we see when the Medes come in and conquer Babylon. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. What's crazy here is that Isaiah is speaking of Babylon as the glory of kingdoms at a time period when Babylon was not the glory of kingdoms. If anybody was the glory of kingdoms right now, it would be Assyria, not Babylon. Babylon was there. They'd been there for longer than pretty much anybody else, but they were just a nation that was growing and growing and growing. They wouldn't be the glory of kingdoms for a long while, for at least 100 years after Isaiah's ministry was over, right? At that point, then they would be the glory of kingdoms, but right now he's describing them in the present as the glory of kingdoms because he's seeing the future. Really cool stuff. But they're going to be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. What he means by this is that Babylon will be destroyed for their sin by the hand of God and rendered entirely desolate and uninhabitable. If you go read the book of Genesis, it makes it sound like the land of Sodom and Gomorrah was actually plentiful and beautiful and wonderful prior to God's destruction of them. That's the land that Abraham's nephew Lot chose whenever Abraham gave him the choice, and Lot's like, that land looks really fertile, I want that land, and he goes over there. But if you actually go to Sodom and Gomorrah now, it's right next to the Dead Sea. The name Dead Sea should let you know automatically this is not a fertile area. The land is filled with salt. It's a desert region. It's the lowest spot on earth. That's pretty crazy. That's what God says he's going to do to the land of Babylon. It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. No Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherds will make their flocks lie down there. But wild animals will lie down there, and their houses will be full of howling creatures. There ostriches will dwell, and there wild goats will dance. Hyenas will cry in its towers, and jackals in the pleasant places. So God says that if you were to go down to Babylon, no shepherd would want to even take his flocks there. No Arab is going to pitch his tent there because there's nothing for them there. Why would they take their flocks there? There's nothing to graze upon because the land's going to be absolutely desolate. Why would an Arab want to dwell there in a tent? There's nothing around there for them to feast upon, right? That'd be like a death sentence. Instead, the only animals that are going to be there are wild animals that are known for not needing much and that they can just feed off the dead carcasses of other things. Its time is close at hand, and its days will not be prolonged. Once Babylon truly rises to power, her days will be numbered. The Neo-Babylonian Empire will only last from 626 to 539 BC, so less than 100 years will Babylon actually be the highest of all kingdoms, the glory of kingdoms. So I want us to keep in mind there, Isaiah is saying that this is coming soon, but that's a very relative term because this is coming from God, who to God a day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years as a day, right? So for God, this is coming very soon. This is the same God who can say, I am coming soon through Jesus, and we're still here 2,000 years later waiting. But once Babylon does rise to power and become the glory of kingdoms, its time will be close at hand and its days will not be prolonged. It will not last a little bit, very long at all. There's more time in between Isaiah's message of destruction and the rise of Babylon than it will be from the rise of Babylon to its destruction. For the Lord will have compassion on Jacob and will again choose Israel and will set them in their own land, and sojourners will join them and will attach themselves to the house of Jacob. And the peoples will take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel will possess them in the Lord's land as male and female slaves. They will take captive those who were their captors and rule over those who oppressed them. Here's where we get our one little nugget of positive information in this entire section. Right here, this is the reminder that once again, Emmanuel, God is with us. God is with his people. What we see here is that God will turn the tables. As Babylon crumbles, so Israel will rise again. In the short term, when Babylon is destroyed by the Medes, the Jews will be released from their captivity to go back to their homeland, where they will renew their covenant to God. We're going to talk about this whenever we get to the later books like Zechariah and Haggai and Malachi. Those are the post-exilic prophets where the people of Israel actually do return to the promised land. As Babylon crumbles, Israel rises again. In the long term, however, God will fulfill his covenant to Israel by laying all sinful nations, represented here by Babylon, to waste and esteeming Israel above them all. Babylon is going to be so sinful and they're going to be so opposed to the people of God that eventually, in the long run, the term Babylon is going to come to represent everything that is evil and opposed to God. It's almost going to be like a lot of times how we speak of the devil. The devil, we always kind of almost view it as these dualistic forces, whereas it's God's the good side and the devil's the bad side, whereas really God is way more powerful than the devil will ever be. But that's kind of how we speak of it. That's kind of what Babylon would be. Babylon would be to God as we kind of view the devil to God. It's not exactly accurate theology, but that's what Babylon represents. It's like the kingdom of the devil, which is going to be interesting considering what we're going to talk about in a little bit. But for right now, Isaiah says the Lord will have compassion on Jacob and will again choose Israel, right? Which implies that he was not having compassion for a little bit and he was not choosing Israel for a little bit, which is interesting because the people are like, but what? That hasn't happened yet. It's going to. And God will set them in their own land, which should also be confusing because it's well, but wait, we are in our own land, Isaiah. You're not going to be. They're going to be sent out. And sojourners will join them and will attach themselves to the house of Jacob. So even people outside of the people of God will come in and they will join themselves to them, kind of like we had with Rahab and Ruth and people who were foreigners who came and became part of God's people. And the peoples will take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel will possess them in the Lord's land as male and female slaves. They will take captive those who were their captors and rule over those who oppress them. So the tables will be totally turned, right? The people who were captives, the people of Israel, they will now be the ones in charge. They will be in charge of their own land because God is still with them. When the Lord has given you rest from your pain and turmoil, and the hard service with which you were made to serve, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. So Isaiah is now talking specifically to the people of Judah once again. And he says, when God brings you back to the land, which once again, they're not going off. They're not going to be leaving the land until 100 years after Isaiah's ministry is over. So Isaiah is just talking very, very future tense. And he says, whenever you return to the land and you finally have rest and Babylon lies in ashes, you will be able to take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. So whenever they return back to the land and Babylon it's an ash heap, they'll be able to sing this song against the king of Babylon, right? And the king of Babylon would kind of represent all of Babylon in general, because typically what we see in the Old Testament and the New Testament is that the leaders of any particular group represent the entire group. Usually the people will be like their leader, and so whoever is put in charge of a nation or a kingdom or a government, they are typically a good summary and representation of what all the people are acting like. What that has to say for us nowadays, probably not looking too good. It means that we're probably falling apart a little bit. But same thing's true here, same thing's true in the New Testament. Who people have in charge says a lot about them. And so this taunt is against the king of Babylon in particular, but it's also going to be very broadly about all the people of Babylon. And this is what the people of Judah will sing in that day. How the oppressor has ceased, the insolent fury ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of rulers, that struck the people in wrath with unceasing blows, that ruled the nations in anger with unrelenting persecution. The whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth into singing. Right, so you see how this is actually this kind of a sarcastic song. It's very sarcastic because it's taunting, right? You're taunting the king of Babylon in his destruction. You're making fun of him because he thought he was awesome. Once again, the sin of Babylon was their pride. They thought they were the kingdom of God. They thought that they were higher than God. That's what we're going to see in a little bit. And so they're being destroyed for their pride, and so now they're taunting them. How the oppressor has ceased and the insolent fury ceased. You thought you had us, but you didn't. Yahweh, the God of Israel, has broken the staff of the wicked and the scepter of rulers. Look at that. The God of little old Israel came in and destroyed all your gods, Babylon. How does that make you feel? He broke the staff of the wicked, the scepter of rulers, that struck the peoples in wrath with unceasing blows, that ruled the nations in anger with unrelenting persecution. So this is what the people of Israel, the people of God, are saying to Babylon. God saw what you were doing. He saw how you struck us in wrath. He saw how you were striking us with unceasing blows. You just kept hitting us even whenever we were already down. You saw how you ruled the nations in anger and how you persecuted them unrelentingly. God saw all of that, and he came to our defense. And therefore he has broken your staff, and he has broken your scepter. That is what the people of God are going to be saying to taunt the people of Judah. This is very interesting because here we have the people of Babylon. The people of God are using to taunt the people of Babylon. What's interesting here is that the people of Babylon are going to be used to judge the people of Judah, and then the Medes and the Persians are going to be used to judge the people of Babylon, and then the people of Judah are going to come back and taunt the people of Babylon. You can see how this is coming like full circle. Very funny, very weird, very ironic. Verse 7, the whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth into singing. With the tyrant kicked off his throne, the whole world sings as a result of the newfound peace. Once again, there is a near and far fulfillment. Many will benefit from the downfall of Babylon, but all will benefit whenever the Messiah finally forces all arrogant, wicked tyrants to relinquish their throne. So once again, little D day of the Lord, big D day of the Lord. The cypress rejoices at you, the cedars of Lebanon saying, since you were laid low, no woodcutter comes up against us. Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades to greet you, all who were leaders of the earth. It raises from their thrones all who were kings of the nations. All of them will answer and say to you, you too have become as weak as we. You have become like us. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol, the sound of your harps. Maggots are laid as a bed beneath you, and worms are your covers. Once again, this is continuing the taunt of the people of Judah towards the people of Babylon. First off, we see that creation itself is personified as rejoicing at Babylon's fall. Trees are rejoicing that they no longer have to be cut down for the various building projects to feed the king's pride. Whenever we look at Babylon and what they built, there's a lot of architectural stuff going on there. And so now the trees are happy that Babylon's being cut down. The cypresses rejoice at you. The cedars of Lebanon saying, since you were laid low, no woodcutter comes up against us. Even the trees are excited that Babylon's falling down because now they don't have to be cut down and separated from their families to go be part of all Babylon's building projects. Once again, it's a taunt. It's supposed to be kind of funny. It's supposed to be kind of ironic. It's supposed to be kind of silly because it's making fun of proud people. That's what's going on here. And then Isaiah is going to describe an imaginary situation, wherein former kings who already dwell in the place of the dead, that's the Hebrew term Sheol, form a welcome party for the newly arrived king of Babylon, mocking him and reminding him that his pride and pomp earned him nothing. He is just as dead as they, and his reward is a bed made of maggots and a blanket made of worms. And so if you can imagine this, once again, this is a taunt from the people of Judah directed against the king of Babylon. And as he's dying, they're painting this imaginary portrait where he's going down to the place of the dead, which this is fleshed out a lot more in the New Testament. You know, we have heaven, hell, all that stuff. But in the Old Testament, it's just Sheol, right? It's the afterlife. He's going down to the place of the dead, and there's all these other foreign kings who he destroyed, and they're there to greet him. And they're like, hey, welcome here, buddy. Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come, right? Everybody's, oh my gosh, the king of Babylon's finally arriving. Let's go greet him. It rouses the shades to greet you. The shades, it's kind of like ghosts, right? It rouses the ghosts to greet you, the already dead people. All who were leaders of the earth. It raises from their thrones all who are kings of the nations. So all the kings of the nations, they're getting up and they're saying, hey, did you hear? The king of Babylon's arriving in the place of the dead today. Let's go greet him. All of them will answer and say to you, you too have become as weak as we. You have become like us. And they're like, oh man, back in the day whenever we were all alive, we were really afraid of you, but turns out you were just as weak as us. You can see how this would be a good taunt against proud people, right? Because they thought that they were indestructible. And now the king of Babylon finds himself in the same place as all those other kings that he himself had destroyed. He was the glory of all kingdoms, but now he finds himself in the same place. He gained the whole world, but he lost his soul. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol, the sound of your harps. Maggots are laid as a bed beneath you and worms as your covers. They're like, hey, welcome to the afterlife. Really glad you're here. And just because you were so awesome on earth, we've got this amazing bed planned out for you, right? So we got maggots laid on your bed beneath you so you can sleep on a bed of maggots. And then we got worms for your covers. And so you got like 5-star afterlife luxury staying. Like, here's your bedding. Welcome to the afterlife, buddy. This is the taunt that they're raising against the king of Babylon because they're saying, guess what, O king of Babylon? You thought you were awesome and you thought you were super important, but now that you're dead, guess what? You're in the same place that all the other kings went. You had all this stuff to gain, yet you gave it all up, and now you're dead. And you didn't take any of it with you. Now you're in the same place, and all that stuff you accumulated and you acquired on earth, it was for nothing. Now you get to sleep on a bed of maggots with blankets of worms. Good job. You played yourself. This is where we get to the section that a lot of people associate with the fall of Satan, and we'll talk about that. But keep in mind, in the context, this is directed to the king of Babylon, and it's the taunt of the people of Judah to the king of Babylon. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you. Is this the man who made the earth tremble? Who shook kingdoms? Who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities? Who did not let his prisoners go home? I'm going to read on a little bit further. All the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in his own tomb. But you are cast out away from your grave like a loathed branch, clothed with the slain, those pierced by the sword who go down to the stones of the pit. Like a dead body trampled underfoot. You will not be joined with them in burial, because you have destroyed your land. You have slain your people. So this is once again the taunt of the people of God against the king of Babylon. And they start off by saying, how you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn. The word translated day star, some translations might say, oh, morning star, something like that. In Hebrew, it is the word chelel, which means shining one. So it's how you are fallen from heaven, O shining one. This is a reference to, I put the Venus. It's supposed to be to Venus. It's a reference to the planet Venus, which is also known as the morning star because it is the first star to appear in the east before the sunrise. Tradition in Isaiah's day saw the stars as representing the gods battling each other for preeminence, with the morning star being the evident victor. The Latin term for morning star is Luciferos, which, accompanied by the traditional interpretation of these verses as speaking of Satan, has led to the common misconception of Satan's name being Lucifer. Hate to break it to you, but it does not seem like Satan's name is Lucifer. That is just the Latin translation of morning star. It's Luciferos, right? So if you go watch the TV show Lucifer, his name is Lucifer Morningstar because it's Lucifer, or Morning Star. That's the whole joke. It's also based off a comic in DC Comics. But yeah. Okay, so let's talk about this. What imagery is being drawn here? I want to spend some time on this part just because of everything in this prediction against the people of Babylon, this is probably the thing that you're going to hear about the most. And so let's spend some time on this before we break down the rest of the section. The imagery that he's definitely going for here is that of the morning star, right? So we have Venus in the distance. They wouldn't have called it Venus at this time period, and even nowadays people still call it the morning star because it looks like a star from a human perspective, right? We know it's a planet, but it looks like a star. It's the first one that shows up in the morning. And so if you have this worldview where it seems like I'm not saying Isaiah believed this, but this is kind of the, almost mythology that would have been going around this time period. It was that the gods were the stars, and they're battling with each other for preeminence. And so the first one that shows up in the morning is the one that showed up victorious, right? It's the one you're like, there it is. It's the morning star. That is the god who won the battle last night. And so this is the most preeminent of all the stars. It is the one of all the different celestial beings in the heavens. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn. So you have this victorious celestial being that is being cast down from heaven. How are you cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low? You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven, above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. This is stuff that we do typically associate with the devil. This entire passage, chapter 14, verses 4 through 23, is directed specifically against the king of Babylon. However, the language Isaiah employs makes it evident that he is historicizing a myth that his audience would have been familiar with, specifically the story of a divine creature being kicked out of heaven due to pride, selfish ambition, ingratitude, and treachery, and applying it to the king of Babylon. We cannot therefore say that it is conclusively speaking about Satan himself, but the character of the divine being Isaiah describes is consistent with what we know about Satan. We're going to see a very similar thing happening whenever we get to the book of Ezekiel, and we have another passage that is typically associated with Satan. It seems like this is where a lot of people, and I'm not saying it's wrong, there's good arguments both directions. I'm just trying to be faithful to the text. A lot of people are trying to explain, how did the devil come to be? We know that the devil was embracing sin and evil before humans were. How did that happen? And they look to passages like this, and they're like, there's the answer. I don't know if we can say that conclusively, because we read this and we're saying, it's definitely talking about a celestial being who was being cast down from heaven. That's exactly like the devil. Well, the reason we believe the devil was a celestial being cast down from heaven is mainly because of passages like this. But we do have passages where Jesus says, I saw Satan falling from heaven and stuff like that. And so maybe there's some legitimacy to this, right? And so I'm not totally discounting it because I do think that is probably what Isaiah is alluding to. I'm just saying that it's a little bit more of a complicated process than we typically give credit to. I want us to understand that certainly what Isaiah is doing is he is comparing the king of Babylon to this proud, arrogant, treacherous, divine, celestial being that was cast down from heaven. Whether or not that is the devil as we know him today, I don't know. Whether or not it could be that this is just a myth that actually didn't happen, but it was well known to the people at the time period, and so Isaiah is drawing this connection. That's also possible. I do think that it probably was a historical reality, and I do think that it probably was the devil who was cast out of heaven. I do think that it's probably true, but I don't think we can necessarily conclude that from this alone, or from a cursory glance at it, right? We actually have to go a little bit deeper. We've got to look into the historical background of all that stuff in order to make that conclusion. But what we do have for certain is that Isaiah is alluding to some sort of myth wherein there was a divine being cast down from heaven, and he's comparing the king of Babylon to that person because that's how proud the king of Babylon was. Whether or not that divine being was the devil and whether or not it was a historically true myth, that's up for debate. But that is definitely what Isaiah is doing. How you are fallen from heaven, O Daystar, son of the dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. Right? So the king of Babylon, he was the one who thought that he could climb up to the heavens. Think about the Tower of Babel, right? This is the Tower of Babel story that personifies Babylon as an entire kingdom. They're constantly trying to puff themselves up and become greater and greater and greater. And that's exactly what we have here. They had ascended to the heavens, but they have been struck down. They were the morning star, but they are no more. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You did all these amazing things. You destroyed all the nations. You proved your power, but now you're being cut down. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven, Tower of Babel imagery. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Here we don't necessarily see the imagery. I think typically we think that this is saying that the king of Babylon or the devil is trying to make himself higher than God. I don't think that's necessarily the case. What we see is that he is trying to make himself like God. He is doing the very thing that every single human being has ever done whenever they sin, right? It goes way back to the Garden of Eden. What was the thing that the devil tempted Adam and Eve to be like? If you eat this fruit, you will be like God. That's exactly what every human has craved. God made us in his image, and we have been making God in our image ever since. And we've been trying to make ourselves like him, and we've been trying to reduce him to our status. That is exactly what the king of Babylon has done, and that's exactly what this divine being has done. He says, I will ascend to heaven. I will ascend above the stars of God. Once again, stars represent the divine beings, the celestial beings. This celestial being, if he's the devil, I don't know, but this one in particular, he thought that he could get above the rest of them. He wanted to be the morning star. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. In Hebrew, the word for the north here is Tzaphon. Canaanites considered Mount Zaphon, or also it's Mount Cassius or Jebel Akra nowadays. Mount Zaphon in northern Syria was considered to be the dwelling and meeting place of the gods, according to Canaanite mythology, similar to Mount Olympus for the Greeks. The king of Babylon will aspire to be enthroned above the gods, yet God will cast him down in judgment. So that's the imagery that we have right here. You can imagine, if you know Greek mythology, there's actually stories where people are trying to storm Mount Olympus and become like gods. That's kind of the imagery that you have right here. You have Mount Zaphon, right? You have the mountain of the north, because Mount Zaphon was way north of Israel. He's wanting to ascend. He's wanting to go climb this mountain. I have a picture of the mountain right there. You see where it's just like peeking right at the very top. The imagery is he wants to ascend this, and he wants to sit on top of that mountain. He wants to sit on the throne of God. And once again, this is imagery that would have made sense to the people of Judah. If you mentioned Mount Zaphon to the actual king of Babylon, he probably wouldn't even know what this mountain was because he lived in a totally different region of land. But to the people of Israel, they would have been like, oh, we get the imagery right here. There's a divine being who is wanting to usurp God's throne. He's not wanting to become greater than God. He's wanting to become God's equal and possibly perform a coup. He's wanting to get rid of God and put himself in his place. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. That is what this divine celestial being is saying. And this is what the king of Babylon is being compared to. This was his mentality. In his pride and in his arrogance, he was trying to make a name for himself. He was trying to compare himself to God. He was trying to live by his own efforts and by his own power in such a way that people would worship him. But this is what the taunt of the people of Judah against the king of Babylon says. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you. Is this the man who made the earth tremble? Who shook kingdoms? Who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities? Who did not let prisoners go home? And so just like this divine being was cast down from heaven, and just like this morning star who wanted to ascend above the stars and who wanted to defeat all of them, just like he ceased to be the morning star, in the same way the king of Babylon, amidst all his pride, will be cast down and he will be humbled. And he will go down to Sheol and into the depths. And all those other shades will be waiting there to greet him. And they'll say, welcome to the afterlife. Here's your bed of maggots. You earned it. But you're brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. The imagery is almost like the Greek mythology idea of Tartarus, right? He's not just in Sheol, he's in the deepest layer of Sheol. You wanted to ascend to the greatest of heights, but now you've descended to the greatest of depths. Those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you. Is this the man who made the earth tremble? Who shook kingdoms? Who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities? Who did not let his prisoners go home? So other people in the afterlife are going to look at the king of Babylon and they're going to say, is this the guy we were afraid of? We thought he was scary? He's just a regular guy. He's even lower than we are now. What's up with that? This is once again the taunt of the people of Judah against the king of Babylon. Because if you go back, God is going to remember the people of Judah. He's going to bring them back to the land. And therefore, when Babylon falls, they're going to be taunting him. They're going to say, ha, 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 Emmanuel, God is with us. He's not with you. You thought that you were like God. You thought that you could defeat the people of God. But God has been faithful to us, and he has proven you wrong. You're in Sheol. We are not. You are in the depths of the earth. We are not. God still reigns supreme over us. That's what the people of Judah would be taking out of this. And therefore they are taunting the king of Babylon in that day because like Lucifer, right? Like the morning star, Luciferos. Like Lucifer, he was cast down from heaven. He ascended to great heights. He was the glory of all kingdoms. But now he is a waste. Babylon is going to be this amazing, amazing, amazing kingdom, but then it's going to be utterly destroyed. Israel, which is a tiny little kingdom that most people didn't, I can't even think of the term I'm thinking of, bat their eyelashes at, right? There's like, oh, it's just like, it's just little, just like a pinprick on a map. But Israel will last. Babylon, it doesn't exist today. Israel, it still exists today. That's exactly what Isaiah is prophesying right here. Babylon made a big name for itself, yet it's going to be destroyed. And therefore the people of Israel will be able to laugh and taunt him. Because they're going to say, guess what? You thought you could destroy us, but God is with us. Emmanuel. All the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in his own tomb. But you're cast out away from your grave, like a loathed branch, clothed with the slain, those pierced by the sword, who go down to the stones of the pit like a dead body trampled underfoot. You will not be joined with them in burial, because you have destroyed your land. You have slain your people. Other kings would receive honorable burials, but not the king of Babylon. History does not make it clear what happened to Nabonidus. I don't know how to pronounce that name. Nabonidus, the final king of Babylon. But the book of Daniel records that his son, the crown prince Belshazzar, was murdered on the night that Darius the Mede invaded Babylon in Daniel chapter 5. Regardless of what happened to their actual bodies, however, Isaiah's main point is that all the glory of Babylonian kings aimed to earn themselves will be brought to nothing. Yes, they shot for heaven, but now they're in the depths of hell. That's the sad part, and that's what we're learning right here, and that's what the people of Judah are taunting him about. They're saying, you thought you could destroy the people of God, but God has destroyed you. You thought that you were better than God. You thought that you could ascend above the heights of heavens. But like the devil, or like whatever mythological figure we're talking about, I don't know if we're talking historical, mythological, it doesn't matter. That's not crucial. The historicity of this event right here, that is not crucial to Isaiah's point. I do believe it was a historical event, and I'm tempted to believe that it is talking about the devil. But that's not crucial to what Isaiah is saying. The crucial point is the imagery behind it. Like this being who was cast down from heaven because of his pride, so too you also, king of Babylon, because of your pride, will be cast down to the depths of Sheol, while the people of God live on. All the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in his own tomb, but you're cast out away from your grave like a loathed branch. You're going to the depths of Sheol, the deepest parts of the pit. clothed with the slain, those pierced by the sword, who go down to the stones of the pit like a dead body trampled underfoot. There's no respect. There's nothing remarkable about his death. He's a dead body trampled underfoot. People stomp on him. You will not be joined with them in burial because you have destroyed your land. You have slain your people. They're not even going to honor you with a burial. May the offspring of evildoers never more be named. Prepare slaughter for his sons because of the guilt of their fathers, lest they rise and possess the earth and fill the face of the world with cities. Not only would the Babylonian Empire come to an end, but so too would the king's posterity. There would be no more left to keep his memory alive. So that's why Isaiah says, may the offspring of evildoers never be named. Right? The king's not going to have any sons. There's no going to be return of Babylon. They're going to be gone. They're going to die, and their family line's going to die with them. Prepare slaughter for his sons because of the guilt of their fathers. It doesn't mean the sons are guilty of what their fathers did, but they're receiving the consequences of that guilt. And they're going to be, sin has consequences, and it affects those who are even innocent. The sons are innocent here, but they're going to be killed because people don't want Babylon to come back, lest they rise and possess the earth and fill the face of the world with cities. So whenever the Medes destroy Babylon, they're going to look at all the royal sons, and they're going to say, we need to kill them as well, so they don't grow up and try to rebel against us and form Babylon again. So it's kind of sad. I will rise up against them, declares the Lord of hosts, and will cut off from Babylon name and remnant, descendants and posterity, declares the Lord. And I will make it a possession of the hedgehog and pools of water, and I will sweep it with the broom of destruction, declares the Lord of hosts. Isaiah's oracle against Babylon ends with the promise that they, unlike Judah, would be left with no remnant. They would be utterly destroyed. Yikes. So that's how it ends, right? So as we've been going through these chapters, we've seen these prophecies directed to the people of Judah, and God always says, I'm going to destroy you, but there's going to be a remnant. There is going to be a shoot that comes from the stump of Jesse. There is going to be this Messiah who's going to reign over the remnant of God's people, and he's going to reign in righteousness and truth and justice, and it's going to be amazing. He's going to reign forevermore, and it's going to be awesome. Not so with Babylon. Babylon is going to ascend to great, great power that the people of Isaiah's time had never even considered. But eventually Babylon's going to be destroyed, and Babylon will fall. And we're going to hear about that destruction even more in a few chapters and in a few weeks. But for right now, our takeaway is that pride comes before destruction and a haughty spirit before the fall. And so, my warning to you would be to try your best to get away from being a proud and arrogant person. Pride is something I have always struggled with. It's an issue. Okay, I'm going to be honest with you. Pride is something that every human being that has ever lived has struggled with. Every time we choose to sin, what we are doing is we are looking the God of the universe in the face, and we are saying, I know better than you. And I know you said to do this, and I know you said not to do that, but I think I know better. And every time we sin, that's what we're doing. We are proud, arrogant people. And that's why Babylon fell. And I'm going to tell you, just like Sodom and Gomorrah, Babylon had no Bible. They probably did not receive these messages from Isaiah. Instead, Isaiah wrote this to the people of Judah, to the people of God, so that they would understand how God felt about proud people. And so you have this example of this devil-like figure in the king of Babylon being cast from heaven and being laid low because of his pride, because he thought he could be like God. And so, dear Christian, my friend, I'm speaking as a friend now, we need to get rid of our pride. We need to humble ourselves. We need to exalt God. We need to make sure that we are living our lives in such ways that we're not trying to be like God in the sense of being equal with him, but we're trying to be like God in the sense of trying to emulate his character and his qualities as lights in the world. But we always need to recognize that while God is our friend, while he is our companion, he is also our king, he is our master, he is our Lord, we are his slaves and his servants. And so we should recognize that there's a chasm between us and him, and we will never ascend to that type of height, nor should we want to. We should humble ourselves, lest we become like the king of Babylon and suffer the same fate as him. Because rather than trusting and placing our faith in God, we rebel against him and swell up in pride. Next week, we will be we'll be finishing up chapter 14 and going through part of chapter 17, That might be all of chapter 17. I don't remember. And we are going to be talking about a throne of Hesed. And I'm very excited because that's going to be our first encounter of the Hebrew word Hesed in the book of Isaiah. And Hesed is one of my favorite words, hence why I've said it so many times. So I hope you will join me there. But until then, be sure to keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy. Thank you so much for watching this video. I will see y'all next time. Once again, if you want access to these slides, you can get those at nowletsbehonest.com/resources. And if you want to support me on Patreon, you can do that at patreon.com/David Tate. Thank you so much for watching. Please be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, share it with all your family and friends, and we should do this again sometime. I'll see y'all later.
You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. For 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.